revolves around the search for water. The sound of finches is always a sure indicator. These ones are drinking at a borehole sunk for stock on the world's largest cattle ranch. Occasionally you can see the course water takes when there is any rain, but it's the start of the summer and there won't be any for months.
It's taken a couple of hours to get here from William Creek, and as you can see, Lake Eyre is anything but filled with water.
A fifth of the whole country drains into the lake, but it's so dry here that it's only ever filled 4 times since records began.
At 15 metres below sea level, this is the lowest point on the whole continent, and it's also the driest. What moisture there is here simply evaporates, leaving the world's largest salt pan.
As Carl and Caroline reached the lake, there was still no hint of trouble to come.
They decided to camp next to this rain tank, which at the time contained about 300 litres of water. Now, because it was windy, Carl drove the truck in here to act as a windbreak, and that's when their troubles really began.
Getting stuck seemed like little more than an inconvenience, and Carl thought he knew how to deal with it.
The first thing he did was look at the tyres. He decided to let some air out of them to reduce their pressure. That's a pretty good thing to do, because if you lower the tyre pressure, you increase its footprint and it gives you more traction. But crucially, he didn't let anywhere near enough out.
So he decided to dig the sand out from around the wheel, but with no shovel in the car, he had to improvise with a plate, and that didn't work either.
As always in survival, the key thing is not to panic, but to think clearly. They weren't in a life or death situation yet. The vehicle was full of food, they had a 65-litre tank of water on board, and this rain tank held 300 litres. They could have stayed here quite safely for weeks.
So they settled in, thinking they'd been missed when they didn't return to William Creek. But remember, because of the mix-up over the search and rescue books, the pub manager didn't even know they were at the lake. On top of that, they'd been told that in the height of the summer, there might be no other traffic for 6 weeks. So when no one arrived the next day or the day after, they must have started to worry.
On the third day, the temperature soared to 41 degrees in the shade. In the open, you can add another 15 degrees to that. The idea of cool evenings out here is pretty relative. But at 4 p.m, they decided to start walking out.
Leaving the car was their first serious mistake, and on top of that they'd made a crucial miscalculation, as the police discovered once they'd translated their log from German into English.
They'd basically worked out that they had approximately 62 kilometres to travel, and for every 10 kilometres they would consume 1 litre of water each.
But they'd based their calculations on walking in Austria. In the heat of an Australian summer, they would have needed far more water than they could possibly have carried. Nightfall, but in an Australian summer not even the dark brings relief from the heat. Carl and Caroline walked on in temperatures that were sapping their strength. After just 5 hours they had to stop and rest. They'd already used a third of their water.
To give you some idea of how hot it was, Caroline's shoes had actually begun to melt. Well, they rested for 5 hours before deciding to press on. But they'd only gone for another hour before they had to stop, as Carl couldn't go any further.
At this point they decided to split up. As the fitter walker, Caroline was still convinced she could make it to William Creek. She took Carl's boots and 9 litres of water and headed into the night. The two would never see each other again. Carl spent the next day in the tent, and at 9 o'clock that night headed back to the camper van, arriving there at 2 in the morning. Then he waited and waited, not knowing whether Caroline would ever reach safety. The police were alerted on the 15th of December. A German couple driving to the lake had found Caroline's body 6 days after she had started walking.
We estimated that she'd been dead for approximately 5 days. And it appeared the amount of water she was intaking was nowhere near sufficient. She would have become delirious and basically fallen down, and that would have been the end.
This is the spot where Caroline's body was eventually found. It's as desolate a place as you can imagine. To get here, she'd walked over 30 kilometres from the lake, but this is only halfway to William Creek. Today, there's just this simple cross that's a memorial to Caroline, but perhaps also it serves as a warning to those who come here unprepared.
As the police searched further down the track, they found notes that Caroline had stuck to the signs pleading for help. Carl was found alive in the van, and the police investigation began. At first it focused on the pub at William Creek, where the manager's son had forgotten to tell anyone that he had started a new search and rescue book. But blaming that misunderstanding would be too easy. As far as the police are concerned, there's always a better alternative to relying on strangers, however well-meaning they appear to be.
Our advice to anyone travelling in remote areas is to nominate a friend or relative that they can trust that will advise the police if they're not back at a certain time. And I think Carl and Caroline should have done that.
Then there was the lack of equipment and preparation. Some people would like to see the hire companies take responsibility for this.
If Carl and Caroline had had even a small amount of training, they need never have found themselves in this situation. Quite rightly, Carl deflated his tyres, but not nearly enough. It took one policeman just 10 minutes to unbog the vehicle because he knew how much to let out.
As for leaving the vehicle, you could argue forever about that. They left because they had been told the track might not be used for 6 weeks, but the tourists who found Caroline's body would have found them in 6 days. All I can say is that in most cases, your chances of survival are far higher if you stay put, and this case proves that golden rule.
If one death stands out as being totally unnecessary, it's the death of Caroline Grosmuller. And I believe this will be a catalyst to get things changed. I'm hoping as a result of this, those persons concerned, i.e. the hire car companies, travel agencies and the police, get their heads together and come up with some sort of policy. Because if they don't, I don't think that this will be the last death in these circumstances.
But I hope that any changes bear one thing in mind. Wild places like this have always attracted people because they provide an escape from all the usual rules and regulations.
We need to be very, very careful that we don't stifle people's opportunity to experience the outback. People have to be allowed to have this experience, but in absolute safety, and I think it can be done.
But nothing's going to happen overnight, so if you are planning an outback adventure, put your own safety first and don't rely on anyone else to do it for you.
I think at the end of the day, if you're going to head out into any wild place, you have to remember that you have a duty of care for your own well-being. That means making sure you have the right equipment, knowledge and training, and following the local advice. If you do all of those things, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't have the adventure of a lifetime.
Next week, surviving with the Royal Air Force.